we're going to release the results of a new poll on what Californians think about these issues. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dave Metts, the Senior Vice President of Fairbank, Maslin, Mullen & Associates, to answer these questions. Dave?
Thank you very much. I'm going to walk through the highlights of a statewide voter survey that we conducted a couple of weeks ago to show how voters react to some of these concepts related to a constitutional convention. But as an overview, a few of the key things that stood out from the results were, first, the mood of the public in this state is about as negative as it has been in decades. Most voters share the frustration that most of you in this room expressed just a few moments ago with the way state government is functioning, and are eager to embrace a variety of different ways of reforming it, improving it, make it operate more efficiently. The idea of a constitutional convention, however, not surprisingly, is one that they are almost totally unfamiliar with. Only about 1 voter in 4 tells us that they've ever heard any discussion of the idea in recent months. But when we describe it to them, when we talk a bit about how a convention might work, what kinds of reforms it might institute, we find that voters are intrigued by the idea, and that more of them are supportive than opposed, at least as an initial concept. Obviously, the ultimate support that voters might lend to a convention will be highly dependent on how a convention is structured, how delegates are chosen, the scope of the reforms that a convention might address. But the data that we are showing you today, I think, indicates that voters find the idea intriguing, and it's clearly worth further exploration. So with that, the next slide highlights the methodology of the survey. We did a total of 800 interviews statewide. They were conducted during the first week of this month, and the margin of error for the results that I'll show you is 3.5%. There's a few places where we highlight some demographic subgroup results, and there it's a little bit higher. So to start with, this data will come as no surprise to anyone in this room, but I think it's helpful to provide some context about how voters feel about how things are going in California right now. The first question in most of our polls, as you'll see on this next slide, as is the case in most political polls, is, do you think the state is headed in the right direction, or do you feel that it's off on the wrong track? This is what we call a decisive result. So by an 82-11 margin, nearly 8-1, voters think the state is on the wrong track. And at a time when it is difficult to find issues in California that unite Democrats and Republicans, 77% of independents, 82% of Republicans, and 83% of Democrats think that the state is on the wrong track. So this is a sentiment that is nonpartisan right now. In fact, there is no major subset of the electorate where even a quarter of voters right now think that California is headed in the right direction. And to give you some historical context for these numbers, on the next slide, you'll see results of this question from polls that have been conducted by our firm over the course of the last 7 years. Now, California has had a lot of mood swings during that time. We had the energy crisis, the recall election, the special election in 2005, a lot of events that were divisive and created some negative feeling among Californians. But you'll note that the previous record low for positive feelings was the second bar from the bottom, September 2003, right before the recall election. And at that point, 14% of voters thought the state was headed in the right direction, 73% wrong track. We have now moved past those numbers from the recall to a point where we have the highest number on record of voters who think the state is headed in the wrong direction. Now, the issues that concern them and that drive this negative feeling that you'll see highlighted on the next slide are not surprising. This was a question where we offered the voters a list of issues facing California and asked them to rate each as either an extremely, very, somewhat, or not too serious problem. The dark red bars on the left represent the proportion that rate each as an extremely serious problem, and you'll see that the budget deficit tops the list, not surprisingly. Some of that obviously is an artifact of when the poll was conducted. A few weeks from now, a few months from now, that number may be lower, but it is not likely to go away. Obviously, the budget deficit is going to still be with us. It's going to be a part of the debate in the next couple of years, and we have seen that number high over the course of the last couple of years. The economy is obviously a top issue, but what I want to highlight here is that other issues that relate to the structure and function of state government are significant concerns for voters. A majority say that the ability of the legislature and governor to pass a budget is an extremely serious problem. And we have nearly 2/3 of voters who say that the amount of state bureaucracy and the way that the state collects and distributes funds to local government are very serious problems as well. So all of this indicates an electorate that is ready for change. And the question is, Does a constitutional convention offer the type of change that they would like to embrace? To delve into this idea, we first asked voters, one other note. Obviously, this has had an impact on state government. On the next slide, the numbers that you see here, President Obama still has 65% job approval among the California public, but both the governor and the state legislature now have significant majorities that disapprove of their performance. Those numbers have been going steadily down in our statewide polling over the past few weeks during the budget debate. So in this context, how do voters react to the idea of a constitutional convention? We started by asking them if they had heard anything about the idea, and we see that 23% tell us that they have. This is divided between 3% who say that they have heard a lot and 22% who are lying. On issues like this, this is what we in polling refer to as social desirability bias. There's always a hesitance to admit that on any important issue of public policy that you're not informed. So what we really do focus on is the top number there, the 3% that say that they've heard a lot about the issue. And that is a very, very low number. Less than 1 in 33 voters in the state right now have heard a significant amount about this proposal. So the information that we present them over the course of the survey for many voters is the first time that they're thinking about these ideas. So anticipating that, we gave the respondents some background about the Constitutional Convention process, which you'll see highlighted on this slide. We explained to voters, we gave them some examples of the kinds of revisions to state government that a convention might consider. We noted, importantly, that whatever revisions a constitutional convention proposes would be submitted to voters for their approval, and also that the last convention was held over 100 years ago. So in this context, obviously the legislature at this point has the power to call a convention, voters don't. But we asked the respondents if voters were given the opportunity to authorize a state constitutional convention, would they vote yes or no? And what they told us on the next slide, by a margin of 49 to 31, is that they would be inclined to vote yes. Now, a healthy 20% remain undecided, and obviously this is not an overwhelming majority in favor of the idea, nor is it a significant number of voters who want to reject it outright. Voters are approaching it cautiously since they don't have a lot of information about it, but there's clearly more positive sentiment initially toward this idea than there is negative. And it also has impressive breadth across the electorate. Again, on most issues relating to public policy, Democrats and Republicans are sharply divided in California, but we see 50% of independents, 49% of Democrats, and 47% of Republicans who initially tell us that they would look favorably on voting for a constitutional convention. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the support for a convention would likely depend on the kinds of reforms that were contemplated. So we also asked the respondents to tell us whether they would support or oppose a variety of specific potential reforms to state government. And on this slide, you will see highlighted the ideas that we saw the strongest support for from the voting public in California. I realize this may be hard for some of you in the back to read, but the first item is essentially an open primary. 67% said that they would support that. Secondly, letting local governments locally keep more of the taxes they collect rather than sending them to Sacramento to be redistributed to local governments. 68% favored that idea. 67% favor the idea of having an automatic review process for state agencies, commissions, and boards every 12 years. We offered the respondents a choice between two options: calling a convention that would be limited to covering a few important issues, or not be limited and cover the entire Constitution. 46% favored an unlimited Constitution, 40% favored a limited one. And obviously, for those who want it limited, there is likely great variation in the specific issues that they would like to see it address. So given some of these background questions about how a convention might operate, we also walked through some pro and con arguments, reasons why calling a convention might be a good idea or a bad idea, the things that would likely get aired over the course of any public debate about the issue, and then asked voters a second time at the end of the survey whether they would be inclined to vote to authorize a convention. And as you'll see, that led to a significant drop in the proportion of voters who were undecided and an increase in both support and opposition to the idea. We have 52% at the end of the survey, a slim majority that said they would be inclined to vote to call